Hello, my friends. My name is Gerdes. I'm just a professor trying to help you understand context so you can see clearly what's happening in the war in Ukraine. Every Monday, I go through a weekly recap, and what I try to do is I try to go with, here's like the big story that was happening on a particular day, and here's a story that maybe you missed or an important story that you need to be aware of. So we'll go back to Monday the 29th. Today is Monday, February 5th. So we'll go back to Monday the 29th of January, and the big story that day was the rumors that Zaluzhny had been fired, and they were very quick in the Ukrainian government to put out, hey, there's been no subjective conversation, there's been no formal removal, there's none of that. So they were tamping that down very, very quickly. The story that you might have missed that day was that Boris Nadzhidin was the opposition candidate who was opposing Putin, and he was actually anti-war. And a few days later, after this particular article, they would find irregularities, and he's probably kicked out by this point, not ineligible at this point, because he's been making some traction. Okay, Tuesday, January 30th, Ukraine rises to 104th place in Transparency International's Corruption Index. That's a story that you might not have heard unless you were listening to my three big stories every night. That is huge. I can't even explain how huge it was. They went from 116 to 104. Meanwhile, Russia went from like 136, 137 to 144, something in that neighborhood. Russia went backwards by a few paces, and Ukraine jumped up pretty significantly in the Transparency International Index. Now, the story that was the big story that day was that Ukraine downed a SU-34 fighter over the Luhansk region, and of course that's going to be the big story, and deservedly so, but I don't want you to miss that Transparency International article. On Wednesday, there were a couple of big stories. Okay, so the first thing was Russia and Ukraine exchanged prisoners of war, and that was pretty significant. Now, so the fighters allegedly transported by Russia on the Il-76 plane were not present during the exchange. Now, remember, this goes back to the Il-76 that Ukraine shot down that made a really big boom when it hit, that Russia said, well, you know, we had your POWs on it and you lost all these POWs, but they didn't prove anything. They showed some documents, but they didn't show any bodies or anything along those lines, no remains. It seemed pretty sketchy, and it doesn't look like there were any POWs from what I can detect. Okay, so Zelensky also to oust top general amid tension over new mobilization, according to the Washington Post. Now, we don't know if that's the case or what it is. We're trying to track it down. The latest today was that there's a shakeup of a number of different key positions that is probable to reset things and reboot and move forward, but we don't know exactly what's causing it. A cynic would say, well, he's just more popular than Zelensky, so that's why Zelensky wanted to get rid of Zaluzhny. So I don't know that that's the case. What you might have missed, unless you were listening to me in three big stories again, was Ecuador to transfer old Russian weapons to the U.S. despite Moscow's protest, and then first Ecuador and now Greece involved in the ring trade. So Ecuador would sell their scrap back to the United States. The United States would then give them newer material, newer military hardware, and that scrap would then go to Ukraine. And that's within the rules, but it's a strange way of doing it, but it's within the rules. Okay, Thursday, February 1st, EU leaders unanimously approved $50 billion for Ukraine. That was huge because nobody thought that they could actually get there because Viktor Orban was in the way, and Orban was, saying he's not going to allow this to pass. Well, I saw the provisions today, the few things that Orban was taking, and another part of this was that Orban claims that he achieved fulfillment of his demands at the EU summit, and he was taking a victory lap about this. Well, I got my demands. He got these two watered-down paragraphs that seem to allow him to say that he can, bring this back up, but they have to have a unanimous vote to bring it back up, so he doesn't really get to bring it back up. So he gets to win in appearance, and he goes away, and so he gets to save face and move on. So that's great. I mean, I wouldn't point out much of the paragraphs how bad they are and that it's not actually doing it. Just let him think he won and move off into the sunset. The stories that you might have missed that day were Ukraine's military chief reiterates a need for unmanned weapons amid the the dispute with Zaluzhny. Okay, so that's big because he keeps talking about like we need more UAVs and other materials, and so he's still setting the direction for the way that the Ukraine has to move militarily in order to be successful. At the same time, Shamil considers manufacture of 1 million drones in Ukraine in 2024 to be realistic, and that's impressive because that's actually shifting the way that Ukraine is operating in battle. This morning, I showed you how these Ukrainian drones are actually functioning. They lose 10,000 a month, but if they're producing 1 million and they lose 10,000 a month, that's okay. They can lose that many and still be successful in hunting tanks at night with thermal scopes and things along those lines. Okay, another story that you might have missed is that Ukraine says that it can't fire more than 2,000 shells a day as Western allies fail to meet pledges. So Western allies were supposed to provide 1 million shells. They've only produced 300,000, almost 400,000, and they'll have more than 500,000 by March. But that's because they were insistent on doing it all within the EU rather than buying them elsewhere and providing them. So they're playing political games, and that's unfortunate. Okay, Friday, February 2nd, 2024. Big story was that Russia finds errors in the candidate hoping to stand against Putin. Of course they did. Like as soon as he started getting traction, they found these irregularities, and we wonder about the ethics of someone who would put dead people's signatures on the in his paperwork, and they cloak themselves in this legality in order to do illegal things to this candidate who wanted to stand for election. He probably dodged a bullet both literally and metaphorically with that. Another big story the same day is that Russia estimates recent troop losses, and of course it's, for the Ukrainians, and of course it's extraordinarily high and unbelievable. But the article that you might have missed was that there is a bill on mobilization that lacks provision on rotation. They're still working through this, and I've seen over the last 2 weeks, this bill keep coming up through the Rada. They're working their way through it to mobilize more folks, and they're trying to get it right, and they're trying to work out what rotation should look like, but they're almost there. Okay, Saturday, 3 February, there was a fire at the Volgograd. I pronounced that right. Thank you for the comments, because I called it Volgograd before, but Volgograd oil refinery caused by an SBU drone attack, and that's pretty significant, and that's like what, the 6th one in a matter of 2 weeks or something along these lines. It's really adding up, and it's going to keep happening. The hits are going to keep on coming. The story that you probably missed was the Czech Republic urging EU states to buy up 500,000 shells for Ukraine beyond the European Union. And in that article, they talked about how it was France really leading the charge, saying, let's produce all these shells domestically, and that's what's causing the congestion where they're not able to actually do that. So if they go outside the EU and purchase them elsewhere, they can get the shells for Ukraine. That was Saturday, February 3rd. Here's Sunday, February 4th. The big story, and of course this is going to be overwhelming as a story, is that U.S. Republican lawmakers announced a bill that provides more military aid to Israel, but none for Ukraine. So that's in the House. About the same time, you see a bill in the Senate that looks like a compromise. Whether it's a compromise, whether both sides think that it's a compromise that's worthy, that's what we're going to be talking about pretty soon, because I'm starting to look into it, and I don't think Republicans are going to be all that excited about it because it doesn't do what Republicans were hoping that this would do. It actually doesn't cure catch and release and other things along these lines. So I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. They're working through the process, but I think it's more policy than it is politics from what I can detect so far, but I'll talk about that a little while later. The story that you might have missed was that 28 dead after a bakery was shelled in Russian-occupied Ukraine. So I was scratching my head going, it doesn't sound like the Ukrainians to target a civilian bakery in occupied area. But then I was reading a BBC article just today that was talking about, well, it made some sense because in that article there were apparently collaborators and Russian officers or some Russian administrators or something that were in there at the time, according to some Telegram channels. Here, I'm going to read this. Kyiv has not commented, but Ukrainian military bloggers have since claimed that collaborators and Russian officials were in the building at the time. So that's what's going on there. Okay, so That's the news for the week. I hope that helps you and gives you a sense of what has transpired. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.